Hello and welcome to Pulse, your podcast delving into all things health, innovation, digital and data. Proudly brought to you by Pulse IT News. I'm your host, Louise Shaper.
And I'm your other host, George Margellis.
George, when we land in people's ears, the Digital Health Festival will be said and done and we'll all be on the other side of the 2 days of partying in Melbourne. But of course, we're recording this just before Digital Health Festival. But so you're looking forward to coming to Melbourne?
Look, flying down tomorrow morning to Melbourne, Digital Health Festival is getting bigger and better and more exciting every year. So I'm looking forward to seeing what I hear some 8,000 people are expected to attend and 10 simultaneous theatres. So it should be lots of fun. Looking forward to catching up with lots of people down there. I think that's one of the real buzzes around it. But yeah, I mean, whoever thought that we would be having digital health festivals? We've gone from conferences to festivals. So what's next?
Yeah, actually, funny story from years ago. I went to an event in Canada and it was like a festival of, I think they called it health tech. It was just on the verge of when we were starting to use the phrase digital health. So I bought the URL for Australia Digital Health Festival. And obviously it's now the property of the Institute. I personally don't own it. I'm not Adam Newman and buy up the URLs, sell them back to the company. So I noticed Digital Health Festival should talk to the Institute because their URL is Digi Health Fest, because I probably couldn't get it because I bought it like a million years ago. So sorry, Digital Health Festival. I didn't mean to.
It just goes to show how progressive you are, Louise. You thought about Digital Health Festival before anyone else.
But well, I didn't pull up. We didn't do it, did we? So yeah, those guys done a great job.
Once upon a time, owning domain names was the buzz, remember? People were becoming millionaires by selling domain names. I'm not quite sure whether that's quite as exciting anymore.
Well, it was the .coms were really valuable, obviously .govs, but .org.au. Now you can, I've do something and it's like .venture partners. I mean, you know, like whoever owns the DNSs, they've had to widen it up. So now they're not as valuable or lucrative, I think.
Yeah, no, I remember in the early days of the internet, there were stories of names selling for millions of dollars.
Oh, yes. Whoever bought sex.com, that was probably a good investment.
Yeah, if only we'd known.
Oh, yeah, well. And so, George, what else has been happening in your life since we last caught up?
Look, it's been a pretty interesting fortnight, hasn't it? So, the election's done and dusted and we got what some people thought was an unexpected result. But I have to admit, I wasn't overly surprised. I've actually always thought Australians are pretty politically savvy. And the reality is the government had a hard job. I mean, they were coming into some really significant headwinds. And I think Australia's always showed their fairness and showed that they know that one term is not enough to solve all the problems. So they gave them another term. They pulled the strings a bit. They didn't give them majority in the Senate. So they've got some controls. But I think it really demonstrates. And I was watching Insiders this morning and there was a really interesting comment about congratulating the Australian public for going through this process again and coming out the other end, still a democracy, still rule of law. By the time people hear this, we'll know who the ministers are. But at this stage, we're not quite sure who the health and aged care ministers are. But I'm putting out a plea to caucus to try and keep things the same so continuity can remain one of the big things that we have go through because there's some big reforms in play promised during the election. So we need to deliver on those.
Well, that's right. Although the innovation minister's already changed. So Ed Husic's not going to be innovation minister. And he's been really out there, really owning that portfolio.
And he was on Insiders this morning and he wasn't particularly happy about it either. So there was some interesting comments made there about that. Like I said, politics is like sausages, isn't it? You don't want to know what's happening behind the scenes. So it'd be interesting to see how it all plays out. But yeah, look, the health minister and the aged care minister, they've had their challenges. They've been fairly open and robust about what they want to do. So let's see how we go for the next 3 years. The challenge, of course, is that after 2 terms, you have to deliver. So this is the challenge.
Well, that's right. But anyway, we will be talking about 1-800 Medicare then, George, because that was the big promise. And I've already had some conversations at Health Direct too. So we will be able to do some deep dives into that once they know more about how that's all going to play out. So that'll be really interesting for us to discuss.
I also had the opportunity to experience the healthcare system from the inside over the last week.
Oh, okay. You're all right?
I'm fine, but my youngest son, while bouldering, which I didn't even know was a thing till last week.
Okay, what's bouldering?
Bouldering is rock climbing without a harness.
Hang on, what? That does not sound like a good idea.
Yeah. It seems like it's the ultimate adrenaline rush, especially as you're falling 3 meters to the ground, which he managed to do and fracture his ankle.
Oh, my God.
So we went through the new urgent care clinics, and I have to say they were quite a good experience. But it did show the challenges we face with a fragmented healthcare system. So, the urgent care clinics was great. They x-rayed him. They saw what needed to be done. They did the best with what they could do, but then they quickly realized that it was outside of their scope. They communicated with the local public hospital really well. Interoperability worked fantastically. They could view the x-rays taken at a third-party clinic, at the urgent care clinic.
What software did they use for that, George?
Not quite sure, actually. I have to look into that.
Was it through My Health Record or was it a third party?
No. I think it was just through their own PAS-type systems. So I had the films, but I didn't have to carry them around. The hospital's doctor. So interestingly, by the time we left the radiologist and came back to the urgent care clinic, the nurse practitioner who was looking after him had been in contact with the hospital orthopedic team. They had seen the x-rays. They said, look, this can't just be patched there. It needs more work done. They organised an appointment to go and see someone at the hospital. And the next day we were at the hospital getting looked at. Again, no carrying films, although we did have to fill in a 12-page paper form at the hospital, which was a bit tedious, but hey, because this is his first admission to that hospital. Look, we then hit the classic struggle of the public healthcare system. So, he was put on a waiting list. He was hopefully going to get admitted that day for what was an urgent surgery, but was relatively urgent surgery. Challenges arose. There was a waiting list. There was a cancellation. There was all sorts of things. We ended up at the end of it deciding to just go through the private system and walked across the road to the local private hospital where the same doctor who was going to operate at the public hospital could operate on him privately and get him operated on that evening. Again, I wonder what would have happened had he not had a squeaky wheel doctor dad sort of sitting by the side making things happen. I mean, otherwise it could have been sitting in a chair in a waiting room at the public hospital till 9 o'clock at night and then get told. And whilst we were at the public hospital, we saw a couple of people sort of get tapped on the shoulder and said, look, it's not going to happen today. Go back home, try again tomorrow type thing. The system was generally pretty good. This wasn't life-threatening. It could have been postponed a couple of days. We had private insurance, so we managed to leverage that. But it's just a fragmentation again, just shows how things are. But ultimately, next week we'll find out how well our GP has been informed, because everyone asked us who's the GP, and they make sure the information goes there. And they all said, tick this box if you don't want it to go in My Health Record. I just circled the box and said, definitely put it in My Health Record. And again, this is where you talk about 1-800 Medicare may be something which will help solve some of those literacy and fragmentation issues. So it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Excellent. Yeah, well, and your son's going to be okay then?
Yeah, 6 weeks at home by the sounds of things, with his foot in his great big boot and a bit of pain killing, but it seems to be so far so good.
All right. And I gather it hasn't dampened his enthusiasm for bouldering, or is he rethinking that?
We need to have that discussion. I may give him the bill from the private hospital. That might scare him enough to...
Yeah, there you go. That'll do it.
Definitely is a combination of male testosterone, bouldering, and I suspect a little bit of showing off may not have been a right combination.
Oh, well, but it's a classic combination, isn't it? Ryan always says he doesn't understand how men live past the age of 30. He's like, anyone that does, it's incredible, because he said you always look back at the dumb shit you do as teenagers in your 20s. You think, how the hell did I survive that?
Absolutely.
Oh, well, I'm glad he's all right.
Thank you. Look, I had an old friend of mine tell me, when I was, because, I've got 3 boys, I asked him for advice, and he goes, boys have to learn from their mistakes. Your job is to make sure they don't get killed during making those mistakes, but you can survive that, you're good.
Okay. All right. Good advice. There you go. See, we like having these public service announcements on Pulse Pod. Well done, George. All right. So, shall we get to our hot topics?
Yep, let's go for it.
We're going to start our hot topics in the US today with the news out of the FDA that they are mandating the use of generative AI for their scientific reviews. Now, they've completed a pilot, and it was so successful that within 6 weeks, yes, the end of June, the FDA scientific review process will be AI assisted across the entire agency. They've cited significant time savings as a game changer, with tasks that used to take 3 days now being able to be done within minutes. Now, George, it currently can take up to 15 years for approval of a new drug, I believe, and the regulation process is about 1 year, give or take. And I do note that the FDA Commissioner, Dr. Macri, said that this technology deployment holds tremendous promise in accelerating the review time for new therapies. So what do you think of this development?
So to date, most of the stories coming out of the US healthcare system have been horror stories. So this one is actually quite interesting and exciting and potentially game-changing, to be honest. So first of all, Dr. Martin Macri, the new FDA commissioner, he's a very interesting individual. I actually heard him speak a couple of years ago at HIMSS in the US. And, he's a well-respected surgeon. He's written a couple of really interesting books around healthcare reform and transparency and medical errors and how to use transparency to improve quality and avoid wastage. So he's actually on the ball. He's someone who you listen to and respect his opinion. And unlike some of his superiors, he actually seems to be a good decision by the administration. Basically, what they're proposing from what I can read is that they use AI tools more effectively within the FDA to evaluate submissions and the various documents associated with them. And I was involved with a medical device FDA submission a couple of years ago. And as I've mentioned before, my son now works in clinical trials. And when you look at these submissions, they range from a few hundred pages to up to over 1 million pages in documents. So these are huge documents with lots of information, lots of data, and it all depends on the type of submission. But if you're introducing a new drug class or a new biologic, these submissions can literally go into the hundreds of thousands of pages. And I don't know about you, but my new standard practice is if I get any PDF bigger than a couple of pages, I throw it into an AI tool, ask for it to summarize, give me key points and action items, and out comes a nice little summary and things I can use. And it helps me decide, do I dive deeper into this PDF or not? And my PDFs aren't measured in thousands of pages. So I'm assuming for these guys, it's going to be a game changer. The key here, of course, I think is just the ongoing evaluation and the risk management. We're starting to see some interesting stories around LLMs that are being fed on data from other LLMs starting to become less accurate. So I think the really key thing here is that management of the large language model they're using, making sure it's accurate, making sure it demonstrates explainability. And I think the other important thing is that the FDA is now going to have AI proficient staff. So this is no longer just something they can throw into Gemini or OpenAI. They're going to need to understand what's happening. They're going to need to understand how to do the proper prompting. They're going to understand what the LLM is doing with that information, how it relates to their governance. So it opens up a new keg of roles at the FDA.
Yeah, a new workflow.
New people. So they're no longer there's going to be, 20 PhDs sitting in a room mindlessly reading through these huge documents looking for aha moments. This is going to be something that AI plays a role, and you're going to need to have the AI people. And as we know, those AI people are few and far between and very highly sought after. So they're going to have to raise the game and about getting people with healthcare backgrounds into the space. So I think it's an opportunity for new roles in healthcare. The FDA is recognized globally as sort of the most important regulator out there just because of the market size and the amount of work that it does. I think it's interesting times and maybe an opportunity for AI to really demonstrate a value base. We've seen sort of lots of discussions around other uses of AI. If they can speed up FDA approvals, if they can make FDA approvals safer, demonstrating higher quality and reducing the cost, because when you speak to drug companies, it's the cost of an FDA approval can run into the hundreds of millions of dollars.
Well, that's right. And I was thinking as well, because even the fact that one of the things that will happen with this significant modification in workflow is the speed. So it's not just the back and forth between the pharma companies and biotech companies and the FDA and, can you clarify this point more further and all that sort of stuff. But the fact that how much time that takes, and meanwhile, all these people at the biotech and pharma companies and at the FDA need to be employed to shepherd that process. Well, one, you're going to need way less people, probably at both ends, but you're definitely going we're talking big dollars here. Like if it takes you can get a drug to market a year faster than you would have, and it could be even faster than that we're talking big dollars in not just savings, but also getting your drug to market and being able to sell it.
Absolutely. Most drugs are limited by their patent life, so getting an extra year out of that patent life will provide, so maybe a good time to invest in some pharmaceutical shares. We are not giving financial advice on this show.
Purely entertainment purposes.
What really excites me, I think, is this new roles for clinical people who use AI, and also the opportunity for transparency, because if this stuff runs through AI, there's no reason why those results shouldn't be made publicly available. And if you look at Dr. Macri's books, he talks very much around the need for transparency. So big opportunity for some radical change and hopefully for the better.
Yeah, this is big news. And it'll be interesting to see TGA and other regulatory bodies, especially the EU, how they respond as well. I mean, if I was the head of a regulatory body, I'd be ringing my mate over at the FDA and asking Dr. Macri to get on a Zoom and talk us through like how they did the pilot, what lessons can be learned, and look at doing it internally at my agency as well, because, you're looking at significant cost savings and a better quality output potentially as well. Like when you're talking 3 days to do a task that now is done within minutes, I mean, that's incredibly radical. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing the flow-on effects as well.
Absolutely. The pros and cons. And again, to make sure the ongoing evaluation is critical as well.
That's right. Well, let's get to our next hot topic. Now, cybernetics is not something we discuss as much on the pod, George, but we are today. So this topic is related to the theme of regulation and AI, and also on the theme of featuring the work of friends of Pulse. So previous guest, Dr. Rachael Dunscombe, has written a piece published on LinkedIn entitled Designing Freedom, Not Control. And in it, Rachael brilliantly applies cybernetics guru Stafford Beer's principles to modern AI governance in healthcare, challenging us to rethink rigid regulatory approaches. Now, Dunscombe argues that traditional control-oriented governance frameworks with their static checklists and pretty much slow approval processes are fundamentally incompatible with AI's complexity and dynamism. Instead, she advocates for something called variety engineering, which came out of Stafford Beer's work, which is about building flexible monitoring platforms for AI governance. So instead of these long checkboxes and, this top-down, you've actually got platforms, tools that are designed to provide ongoing monitoring and dynamic assurance. She also argues for the need for high-quality standardized data infrastructure so that we can capture meaningful and structured information. That's semantic interoperability for those playing along at home. And she also argues to establish meaningful feedback loops that can track AI recommendations against real-world patient outcomes. And this caught my eye because I was thinking that for health tech leaders, her article really poses a compelling challenge. Like, how might we design AI governance systems that manage complexity, but without sacrificing innovation? So the need to balance operational autonomy, but within ethical boundaries to ultimately enhance rather than restrict human potential and freedom in this incredibly complex world of healthcare. And I was thinking, George, surely clinicians would also feel much safer if they know that we've established rapid, meaningful feedback loops so that both successes and failures in patient care surface immediately, as Dunscombe suggests, because of course, the way regulation is normally done, like you complete those hundreds of thousands of pieces of paper, as we were discussing in our previous topic, send it off to the regulatory body. There's some back and forth. Eventually, you get approval to use it, but that it's a static product. Like the ingredients don't change, whether that's the ingredients of a drug or the ingredients of a biotech, piece of hardware. But of course, AI's everything does change. That's sort of the point. So this idea of having these platforms, but keeping human in the loop, where it's this ongoing regulation and monitoring, I thought was a really interesting idea. What were your thoughts?
First of all, I have to say, you've got to love Rachael Dunscombe.
Oh, yes. Legend.
I'm really pleased. She's actually an ECH Alliance ambassador like me, and we get together on calls every couple of months, and she really is smart. She's really dedicated and she's really passionate about improving health. So kudos to Rachael. And this is a deep dive topic that most people in this space would probably push away from. I first heard the word cybernetics back in the 1970s. And I know most people listening probably can't remember the $6 Million Man TV series. He was the first cybernetic person out there. The buzzword about cybernetics has been around for a while, but it's a very difficult concept to understand. And it really is a deep and meaningful engineering concept. So I'm not going to even try to say I understand the whole logic behind it. Seriously, regulation and governance in AI is such a new field, and we really need to think about how we do it. We can't just take governance models designed for document-based processes back in the 20th century, even 21st century. We can't even think about the governance around the internet, because the internet, again, was basically a whole bunch of interlinked documents. This is a whole new field that we really have to get our head around. And Stafford Beer was a very progressive thinker. He had his head around this managing complexity without, and I think this is the key thing, without limiting its potential. Because one of the big challenges we face, and we've had lots of discussions. I mean, everywhere you look now, there's conferences and papers around governance and regulation of AI. But if we make that governance and regulation so tight that we think we have full control of it, well, the cost of that is that we lose much of the potential advantage of the new technology. So we're going to basically stifle the technology before it's even born. However, if you make that governance too loose, well, we've all seen the Terminator movies and we think about potentialities. And people much smarter than me have said that AI can be the best thing that happened to the world or the worst thing that happened to the world. So we need to make sure we think about it. When you look at Stafford Beer's work, he talks about embracing variety. And one of the key things there was ensuring high quality information flow, which create effective feedback loops and balance that autonomy. So it's really about I guess we can start off by putting some governance around the data, make sure the data that's being fed into the AI is high quality data. I think that's something we can get our heads around now. We still need to have a better understanding of what's happening within the AI and that explainability. And that means having AI which tells us why it's come to these solutions. But I think it's, again, really important to enable that flexibility. The one thing I would say is we really probably need to get Rachael back to tell us in more detail about this, because I think this is potentially a huge issue going forward. The Australian government's been talking about regulating, every government in the world talking about regulating AI. We don't want to dumb it down.
Yeah, you don't want to stifle innovation.
Yeah, exactly.
And you've got those two schools of thought. So, you've got the US, which is like anti-regulation. I mean, this is generically speaking, of course. And then you've got Europe that are regulating to the point that people are quite critical of it, that it's stifling innovation. And then you've got countries like where we live going, oh, this all sounds too hard. Someone else will solve it. Like, I'm going to look over here instead. But, Ed Huzik, we did mention him at the beginning. He put together, was it a year ago or something, like an AI governance
task force,
yeah. And we failed to put a single health person on it, and as we know, there is world-leading AI researchers in Australia that I know nominated to be on that and did not get a look in. And, health is such a complex area because, of course, human beings are the most complex engineered species. And we actually have created a very complex system as around the delivery of healthcare. So, yeah, maybe we do. We'll get Rachael back on later on to talk us through these concepts, because I do think having open data that's actually meaningful and structured is really critical. And yes, I'd be interested to learn more about the idea of AI governance, that instead of, yes, that tick box assurance process, that it is this like live system and a platform. How would we go about if you're utilizing a system and it's a platform that's doing ongoing monitoring and performance? Is that feeding it back to you as the system owner, as the system user, to the regulatory body? Like, how do you know when you're putting up the orange flags that, hey, something's not quite right here? But if it could be integrated and work live in real time, that would deliver immense value to everybody.
Look, the other thing we can't ignore, obviously, is that many of the largest AI tools are now owned by mega corporations, and how that all fits into the play as well. And, can you actually regulate mega corporations, and do they need their own internal regulation mechanisms? So,
yeah, because that always works.
It really is a complex area. So I think we'll be watching this with great interest over the years. And I think it's always good to go back and watch a Terminator movie once a year just to put your head back in the space. What can happen if it all goes wrong?
Yes, and you're wearing a Terminator shirt. You've got Arnie. Very good. All right. Well, let's get to our next hot topic. Now, over to the UK and startup funding now. Now, in a report from HSBC, Innovation Banking and Deal Room, that has ranked the sectors that have attracted the most venture capital funding, there was a surprising finding. Now, London is well known for its finance sector, and one would reasonably expect that fintech would be ranked number one in this report. But one would be mistaken. Health was actually ranked number one, meaning that the most amount of venture capital funding in the first quarter of 2025 in the UK has gone to health startups. And the gap is significant. We're talking £1.8 billion that went to health tech and life sciences. And fintech, well, they raised a mere $724 million in comparison. George, what do you think this means?
There is an old saying, one swallow does not a summer make. And I would argue one quarter does not a health innovation revolution make. And I particularly note here that 2 companies make up over 60% of that investment. However, in general, it's good news for our beleaguered friends in the UK. They're having some hard times. So the fact that there's money flowing is great. But having a startup led by a Nobel Prize winner who has also been knighted, and I note with pride, he's also originally of Greek Cypriot descent, is probably not your normal startup that happens every quarter, you know. And $600 million is not a drop in the ocean. But and the other one of the competing with Ozempic. So it is a general health thing, but I think again it's a good sign that money is starting to flow back into the sector. The fact that AI predominates is interesting. A little bit concerning because, you know, whilst I agree it's a really important tool, I'm still a little concerned that we're generating this huge AI bubble, which if it does burst, will leave the sector decimated for a long time. You know, I've lived through a few of these so-called AI winters and tech bubbles. So we need to make sure that we're able to make better decisions about who's being funded and making them sustainable. Look, startups need support. Startups need funding. I note that, you know, an Australian company in San Francisco, Australian-led company in San Francisco, Superpower, just raised $30 million. So there's stuff happening. And Health recently did a report talking about, you know, the sleeping giant awakes. There's all this stuff happening. The challenge is still to get those startups to the point where they're clinically relevant. And I think that's where we still have that major challenge. But if they have extra money to throw around, some good companies in Australia for them to invest into HSBC. If you want to come down under, come and throw some money around here too.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, haven't sort of officially announced it yet, but I can just say it on the pod because, you know, there's only you and me talking, George. Yeah, one of the new things that I'm starting to spend time on is working with colleagues in the UK, the US and Saudi Arabia on actually building a network that will actually help companies, mostly startups, but it could be established companies as well, move into different geographic regions and, you know, attain some market share in those regions. So yes, we're a big fan of anything that actually puts money into health and digital health. But I just thought it was very cool that the number was so much bigger, even if you did take out the DeepMind funding or the DeepMind co-founder, the company was Isomorphic Labs and the other company that's doing the rival is Ozempic. So even if you take them out, it's still a huge sum of money to life sciences and digital health. So yeah, we'll keep an eye on it. And like you said, great to see this ongoing trend of investing in something where, let's face it, market forces tell you that someone's got to get this right. And, you know, we can really reshape healthcare because we need to.
Absolutely. Again, you know, you and I have been following this for decades and we've seen it progress. We've seen it evolve. The metric shouldn't just be the amount of money. It should actually be the outcome. So we need to continue to focus on delivering from these startups, not just financial returns for investors, but tangible returns for people in the real world.
Yep, that's right. All right, now returning to Australia, New South Wales Health have commissioned a report from the CSIRO, which is Australia's national science agency, looking at the health megatrends that are anticipated to impact the healthcare workforce over the next 15 years. But of course, these megatrends, pretty much by definition, are forces that will shape and potentially redefine the very nature of healthcare and health workforces globally, especially when you look at the convergence of them. So we thought they were worth an exploration here. Now, there's 6 megatrends. The first one is under the heading Limitless Care, which the report defines as the traditional boundaries of the health system expanding, creating changes in how, where, and who delivers healthcare services. George, your thoughts?
What a revolutionary idea. I mean, things like telehealth or delivering care where it's needed.
1-800-Medicare, does that fit in there?
Yeah, I think we may have touched on some of these issues in the past podcast, Louise. What do you reckon?
I think we had, but it'd be great if this report can help get traction because we know that the business models of healthcare do need to evolve and modify so that we can actually improve the healthcare system. And one of the things that in this incredibly wicked, complex system of healthcare that stops that transformation, there's lots of things under that list, but one of them is those traditional boundaries remaining in place. This is how we've done healthcare forever. This is how we have to keep doing healthcare. And those that questioned that, you know, shut down in cases. I noticed, it made me think as well, David Rowlands wrote a really great paper. I'll also put that a link in the show notes. I think it was just before COVID he wrote, What is Digital Health? And that paper talks about role convergence. So the idea, if you are a GP, if you're a surgeon, if you're a nurse, if you're a physiotherapist, we have very strictly defined boundaries of practice, what you are allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do as a specific profession. And in David's paper, he talks a lot about the need, and what will happen is that role convergence where, yes, maybe the core of what you do as a physio is always going to be core to a physio, but a lot of that other stuff is sort of like in an outside circle, which will meld and change and grow, and there'll be other people who will be able to do those things. And we're seeing that in real time now with pharmacists being able to prescribe.
Look, that's been a real bugbear in our sector, and that because we have such strict rules about what we're reimbursed for, that we only do specifically what we're reimbursed for rather than think about a holistic view of the patient and the whole system. So again, the terminology is interesting, limitless care. I mean, I think the fact that many of the limits we have now are legislative limits, not personal limits. So we need to make sure that we break down those barriers. A lot of the limits are financial limits, so we need to break down those barriers. We also need to think about the multidisciplinary team. Care isn't just provided during your 15-minute GP consult. Care is something that's 24/7, 365 days, especially for those with significant chronic diseases and ongoing health issues.
Yeah, that's right. And I figured that's where the term limitless care, it was really about taking down the boundaries, providing equity of access to care rather than you can just have whatever you want, whenever you want, because that wouldn't work. All right. Well, the second megatrend is empowered consumers, engaged communities. George, anyone who's listened to this podcast or indeed followed either of our careers for any stretch of time know that this is a topic that we're not just passionate about, but we do what we can to influence the sector and amplify the voices of consumers. Were you pleased to see this one as number 2 in the report?
Look, probably should be number 1, to be honest. But yeah, I think it's great. Like I said, you were the first one to bring out e-patient day. We've had lots of discussions. We've had Tina Pernat on our podcast. The reality is the only way you can scale the healthcare system is to have the consumers playing an active role in that healthcare service. You know, we talk about self-care and all those sort of models, but the reality is a well-informed consumer with access to the right information at the right point in time. We talked about health literacy earlier in our podcasts. These are the key things that enable the just saying throwing the burden on the consumer without giving them the tools is not going to work. So we need to make sure we provide the right tools for them to be able to facilitate their healthcare journey and optimize it for themselves. And this is where personal choice comes in. I've spent a lot of time in aged care, and people have different ideas about how they want to go forward. And we need to, again, empower them with the tools to make an informed decision and then respect their informed decision. And I think that's really an important part of it.
That's right. Well, this topic will be mentioned in pretty much every episode of Pulse as we continue to record these from the studio. So I will leave commentary for the future, but agree. It's good it's at least number 2. Maybe it could have been number 1, but, not here to critique the order. All right, number 3, mass personalisation. So precision and personalised medicine holds just so much promise, but there's no chance of it being realised why we continue to have siloed health data systems, incorrect and poor data capture. We don't budget for the ongoing need to spend money to take advantage of advances in computing power, and we don't spend money on uplifting the skills of the workforce anywhere near to the degree we need to. And we continue to install new systems that aren't able to capture the type of data required to make health and medicine truly personalised. Now, the report, that's my commentary, that's not what the report says. The report poses these things and poses a lot of questions that we should be reflecting on and asking ourselves. But that was my initial thoughts when I was like, yes, can we please just make this happen? It seems like such a pipe dream. I don't know how long it's going to be before we really realise this, because technically we can do it now.
Look, personalisation relies on high quality information available at the point of care. We've talked about interoperability. We've talked about data standards. We've talked about data sharing by default. All those sort of things are a key part of it. You can't personalise if you don't have the information to personalise around. So we need to focus on health information systems that are usable and effective. And then, nothing new there. Again, I think we've probably spoken about it 24 times in our 24 podcasts.
Okay. Well, the next one is definitely a topic that we talk about pretty much every episode as well, George. Number 4 is augmented care, utilising AI, robotics, and other digital solutions as a way to help meet healthcare demand and free up clinician and admin time to focus on more complex tasks. What are your thoughts?
The recommendation there should just be listen to the Pulse podcast. That'll give you the information you need. You don't need to do the research. Here we are. That's what we talk about every time we get together. Again, using new and exciting tools to deliver high quality care that's evidence-based. Been a mantra for a long time. And I think this article's done a great job in collecting the key zeitgeist thoughts that we've had around healthcare and combining them into a single document. But action is a limiting item here.
Yeah. And with augmented care, you're right, George. I mean, and this is a maturity level as well, isn't it? Because so much of our healthcare system globally, not just here in Australia, is really, I mean, you've got people like Chris Longhurst, friend of Pulse, charging the way in how we can actually make use of good AI and have evidence-based decisions around its use and its value. But there really is a maturity gap here, which will take time. One of the things that I was reflecting on when I read this one as well, George, is I just started teaching at University. And so the class was just yesterday, so it was great. Anyway, and, I think there's like 150 odd people enrolled in this particular unit and, 20 actually show up for class because it's all virtual these days. But a few of the clinicians that I was talking to in the class mentioned, because, we were saying, oh, what made you come and do this master's, or some are doing a grad cert? And the amount of clinicians, and they were all different types of clinicians mostly, not all were clinical, but they said that they told their colleagues, oh, I've enrolled, I'm doing this, and they're excited about it. And they were not supported by their clinician colleagues. Like, one person said that someone got very upset and was like, why are you doing that? Like, that's just all about robots going to replace us, and really not supportive of their colleagues' study choices. I was really quite saddened to hear that. But the startups that I work with, the clinical startups, they hear the same thing often. So yes, I think we've got to do better as a sector, as a digital health, to actually make people realise this is a good thing for everybody. This is not a bad thing at all.
You're right. I mean, the clinician culture is very focused on the way they've always done things. You go through a series of exams to get your specialty. You do a series of trainings. They've focused on that for many years, and they haven't changed that model because it's what they've relied on to sustain their career. So clinician engagement, I think, is critical here. The mere fact that we now have CMIOs, which we didn't have 20 years ago, is a great start, but we only have them sitting in corporate headquarters or in government main offices. We need that sort of level of support. I remember years ago, someone was trying to do a thing called the CXIO network, Louise. You might remember that experience, where we actually went and spoke to junior clinicians about what is digital health, and then, of course, after 1 year, the funding was pulled out.
And it's such a shame because we've got such great turnout. We sort of did like grand rounds, but on digital health. I went and talked to everyday clinicians who would come with their sandwiches, or we'd provide lunch. It was good.
And some of the people who are at those events still come up to me and sort of say, you look at that presentation that you guys did back then drove me to do these things. I won't go through many names, but there's a whole bunch of people who have sort of said, well, that was our first introduction to it and we've followed it through. Problem was there was no follow-up. And this is the big issue we had. I mean, this is why I had to leave the public health system 25, 30 years ago. There was no career path for someone who was interested in technology and medicine. It was either technology or medicine. You had to make a choice. Back in those days, technology paid a lot better. That's why I made a choice.
That's right. Okay, well, there are last two. So the second last one, number 5 in the Megatrend, was called A Volatile World. The need for the health system and its workforce to build resilience to these external factors like climate change, infectious disease outbreaks, etc., that impact public health and create increasing uncertainty and volatility. George, is climate change still a thing? Because you wouldn't know it from the lack of interest by political parties in recent global elections, including the current one here.
Look, it's interesting because there's actually now a huge growing literature about climate change and its effects on health, and also health's effect on climate change. So it works both ways. And there's a lot of evidence that healthcare is one of the least green industries around, and we need to pick up our game around how we deliver healthcare in a more climate cultural type of way. But the reality is 1 degree increases in temperature can lead to huge rise in pandemics and whatever. So there's a really interesting discussion happening within the healthcare domain around the importance of it. This particular election, I think we haven't seen it as much as we should. We do know the Greens and the Teals are looking at it. It still remains an existential threat.
Oh, it is, yeah. There's quite a few people globally, but also some people in Australia who are really leading, looking at climate change and the intersection with climate change and informatics and digital health. So let's make that a future podcast chat, and we'll get an actual expert on to talk to us about that. All right, now the final one, which is another favourite topic of ours, George, the prevention potential, something that we both care a lot about, and we will continue to discuss on the pod and ask the question of what will it take before preventing illness and disease and extending health span is actually prioritised by the institutions that are currently paid to treat illness?
Look, prevention is not new. I've highlighted that Hippocrates' writings back 2,500 years ago talked about preventative health. So we have to learn from the past, but implement it. At the moment, we're seeing this new longevity push, and that may well be the wedge that gets prevention into discussions more likely. But we need to, again, make sure we have evidence base around this. So, we've seen things like Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop Labs and Brian Johnson. Those aren't evidence-based prevention models. We need to make sure we have good evidence-based prevention models.
That scale.
And again, most of it comes down to social determinants and education. So good sleep, good food, good exercise, good communication, 4 key pillars of prevention. How do we turn those into solutions that are usable? We can. Technology can play a role. I've seen some great examples where technology has facilitated decision-making around improving sleep, improving diet, improving exercise. In aging, we've seen loneliness as one of our biggest issues.
And for young people too, not just in aging.
And it's interesting, that's right. I mean, I look at my experience at university. I went to university, and back in my day when I went there were 300 people in a lecture theatre. Now you talk about lecture theatres with 10, 12 people in them.
Oh, and they're virtual lecture theatres as well.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, lecture theatres where just you sitting on your desk. And that social interaction at university, I mean, people I met at university in person 40 years ago are still some of my best friends. Those sort of things getting lost are critical. Is tech the answer? It's not the only answer, but hey, sometimes it's part of the answer. So we need to think about how we implement them.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this does come down at the essence is utilising technology, but it's really about modifying the business models of healthcare, which is a favourite topic of ours. Well done, New South Wales Health and CSIRO for putting together that report. Hopefully by us discussing it on Pulse, you get a lot more readers of that report globally, because it's not just for New South Wales Health. It might be who funded it, and thank you again. But, these things are really global issues. So, yeah, good to have a chat with you about them, George. Well, time for a quick break. And when we return, we are going to be exploring demographic shifts that are shaping healthcare delivery with the one and only Bernard Salt. Now, Pulse Potties who tune in regularly, you would have heard part 1 in our previous episode. Today, you get part 2. If you're new to Pulse, we are so glad you're here. Welcome. Please keep tuning in, but you might want to go back and listen to the last episode and let's pick up that conversation with Bernard from when it started. But we'll pick up part 2 where we left off.
It was a great discussion with Bernard. So if you missed the first part, go back and listen to it, because I think you'll come well informed.
Bernard, I remember being in primary school and learning about basic demographics. The numbers have been there for a really long time, and yet we haven't seen many global policies change the way that we plan, change the way we deliver healthcare, and even the very business model of healthcare. Have you seen examples that have been done well? Or, do you hope that it will be done well? Because we're running out of time.
We are running out of time. And in fact, I have done some work where I've estimated the number of people aged over 85. Technically I think it's over 80, but over 85, the odds are that you're going to need some pretty serious health support. The number of people aged 85 and over, just think of that as a bucket, has been growing at about 10,000 per year for the last 50 years. An extra 10,000 survive beyond over 85 and live into their late 80s and 90s. An extra 10,000 per year. The number this year is 12,000 extra. In 2030, it is 62,000 extra. And that is because you get people born in the late 1940s tipping across the 85 line. And, you've got this exponential growth in high care target demographics moving into that stage of the life cycle. Now, if you are managing a nursing home or a healthcare facility or an aged care facility or whatever, you've fought the way to the top, you've got your hands on the wheel, you're running this business, and you're going to get whacked by this freight train coming at you from 12,000 a year to 62,000 per year, literally over the next 6 years. What a time to be running a business like that and to be responsible for the care of the patients and to be responsible for the funding and finances of that business. Look, just coming back to your question, what policies have worked? Well, you can see a couple of policies that have been in response to the demographic issues. I think it was Paul Keating's superannuation guarantee in Australia, introduced in about 1992, 1993. So we've got superannuation. So that's sort of helped. There's also been, across a number of countries in the Western world, including Australia, a steady pushing back of the age at which you're able to apply for the aged pension. So it's now 67 and a half or 68 or something like that, as opposed to 65. But that's kind of in government's favour, isn't it? If you push back the age of accessing the pension, it means more tax. You can claim more tax for longer before you actually have to pay back. But the real challenge will be in delivering the care, the labour pool, and the funding that will be required when the baby boomers, en masse, 5 million of them or thereabouts, dwindling, hit their 80s, let alone their mid-80s, literally over the next 10 years or so. Now, that's the toughest time to be the Australian Treasurer, not necessarily over the next 3 years, but the 3 years beyond that and the 3 years beyond that is the way I would look at it.
So one of the things, the big buzzwords now, of course, is this concept of lifespan versus health span, and this idea that by doing all these longevity things, we will keep people healthy for longer. The jury is still out how well that works because it's a long-term thing, and often it's what you do when you're 30, which affects what happens to you when you're 80. So it's a long time ahead. What's your thoughts around that model of making people healthier longer? Is it feasible? Is it realistic? Or is it a buzzword bingo type?
I think it's entirely feasible and realistic. The baby boomers, as I said, it always comes back to us. They've been hippies, punks, dinks, yuppies, sea changers, tree changers. They are not going to waft off into old age like their parents did. They're going to redefine it. And if you connect into any of these baby boomer sort of late 70s, early 80s, eventually, communities, they are saving the planet, they're singing in a choir, they're doing Pilates, they're planning a trip or whatever, they're learning technology. I think there's a lot of learning, a lot of fun, a lot of engagement. I understand that this is not everyone, that there are people doing it tough, that are lonely, that are all sorts of issues that they must deal with. But from my observation, there is a great sense of fun and community. That question around the mental health, the time in the life cycle when you are least likely to be depressed and suffer from anxiety is across your 70s. House is paid off, you're not working, you're still reasonably fit and healthy, you've got grandkids surrounding you, your kids have partnered up or whatever. Best time in life, you would argue. Well, if I think back to my grandfather who started work at 12, died at 62, never got to those years, never experienced the dividend of a lifetime spent working literally hard manual labour for 50 years or so. Now, there's a photo of him at his wedding. He was like 20 or whatever it was, handsome young man and fit and healthy, whatever. And another one, 6 months before he died, after he smoked a packet of turf cigarettes every day or whatever, and worked outside in the sun without sun cream and all that sort of stuff. And you think, oh my God, he looks like he's 90, but he was 62. And I think that generation compared to my generation, our generation, I think we have done it better, but I think we can do it a whole lot better yet. And by having these discussions, these podcasts, focusing on the specific issues, I think we can make it even better in the next 10 years or so.
Oh, that sounds very promising. I like that. All right, well, let's go on the other side of the spectrum slightly. So you've written, Bernard, about the studentification, I love these words you make up, of Australian cities. So let us know, what do you mean by that and why is that an important demographic trend?
Well, it's an important demographic trend because there's 27 million people on the Australian continent. 1 million of those are students. This is not a market that existed 25 years ago in a modest number, but we started to ramp up the student intake, the whole idea of let's create a new export market, export education services and we're going to bring students in. They will pay us a fee and we'll educate them and then we'll send them back. And actually, we will cherry pick the best and brightest to remain in Australia as Australian citizens and go straight into the workforce. Now, it's a good deal for Australia in terms of, it generates a lot of income, generates a lot of talent. It creates what people call soft diplomacy relationships with nearby countries. Now, if you spend 3 or 4 years here, from 18 to 21, 22, 23, you get to understand the Australian way of life, how warm and wonderful we are as a people. So you're sort of sending little mini ambassadors back to other nations, in fact. And of course, the other demographic issue is that this 1 million or so students we have at the moment congregate around universities. They tend not to live out in the outer suburbs and commute into the central universities. They kind of live around these areas. So it drives demands for apartments, for example. And you would argue, I think, deliver a certain energy into a community. There's a lovely story. I do some work in New Zealand occasionally. There's a story of Invercargill. It's the bottom of the South Island. It's the next stop is Antarctica, basically. It's about 50,000 people. And it was losing people for many years, losing about 1% population per year. And they changed a policy making attendance at the local polytechnic, like a university, fee-free. And all of a sudden, you had all of these young people descend on Invercargill and this cold place that had been losing population. And there's this lovely story that I came across when I was there. People said, it was funny, the first day of uni at the Polytechnic, all these new young students aged 18 were walking down, so many of them, they were walking down the main street and they were holding hands and some of them were kissing. And old people came out to look at the young people. This is my point about it delivers energy and diversity into a community. And there's a sense of fun. If you've got 18 to 22-year-olds, there's an energy and an optimism and a can-do-ism and random kissing that takes place in public places. It just changes the mood of the place. Anyway, so that's certainly the case in the university precincts across Australian cities. Now, I do understand we need to get the numbers right, and there has been some issues with people returning from the pandemic and so forth. But overall, yes, this is a new demographic feature to the Australian population.
I live quite near one of our major universities and we've seen a boom in accommodation provided for students. But you're right, it does change the dynamics and it does give it a new level of excitement. You made a very interesting point around we try to keep the best and brightest here. What can we do to foster that idea of Australia as not only just somewhere to do your schooling, but to come here and grow new businesses, grow new organisations?
Well, there is an issue that we are confronted with. If our birth rate is plummeting, as it is, below replacement, we need young workers and we need to attract them from overseas to be the waiters as well as to be the plumbers, electricians, the carpenters, the teachers, the nurses, all of that sort of thing. And so if we attract candidates here that pay us to educate them to our standards, and some of them choose to or would like to become Australian residents, citizenship is another issue, which they may choose in due course, then I say, well, that's a good deal for Australia. Now, the reality is that they come here at 18, they qualify by 22, and then they go into the workforce. So to get people to go into the Australian workforce at the age of 22, when we have not had to pay for their primary school, their secondary school, their housing, at the age of 22, if you go into the workforce, you are paying more in tax to that country than you are receiving in services, because you don't need primary school, secondary school, housing, whatever it is at that time for 22 years until you become a tax exporter into the country. Now, the deal is that, 50 years later, they then draw down on the taxes that they paid through retirement and healthcare or whatever. But theoretically, they've also paid into superannuation along the way and have made that contribution. And this is why the developed world nations would want young, skilled immigrants who are civic-minded and aligned with the values of that country to come into that country go into the workforce, fill the much needed jobs that are needed, and pay tax to the country to deliver services. That's kind of how the model works.
I fully agree with you. Again, that diversity they bring, but also that opportunity for going forward is fantastic.
Well, yes, that's true. It's the principle, I think, works. What the problem can be is the volume control. It's a bit like, yes, flick the switch and yes, allow them to come in, encourage them and whatever. But it needs to be managed to ensure that you're not flooding. It's for everyone's benefit that it needs to be sensibly managed in a way that delivers good outcomes for everyone involved.
Well, if we take all these trends together that we've discussed today, what, in a nutshell, does Australia's healthcare system need to do to evolve, to be on top of all of this and make the most of the opportunities?
Well, I'd love to give something that's curated just to health, but I think this applies to a number of industries. It could be home building, building and construction industry as well as the healthcare industry, as well as the education industry. It is about making sure that you are investing in the pipeline of skills, delivering the right skills and the right volumes to deliver the services that are required. I think the greatest challenge is across health in Australia, because health also includes aged care, and that's certainly an area that will become increasingly pressing going forward. So funding, fighting for and protecting the funding stream that is required, ensuring that we have exactly the right number of skills and labour coming into the country to deliver the pipeline for the nurses and the doctors and the carers and the cleaners and others that are required to make a healthcare system work. I've actually done quite a bit of work with the healthcare system. I remember speaking to the CEO of a hospital a few years ago, I won't say which one, and I said, well, you probably need, I can look at the number of doctors and GPs coming through. She said, well, Bernard, we run a hospital here. It's like a city. We need plumbers, we need electricians, we need carpenters, we need cleaners, we need kitchen hands, we need gardeners. We need everything. In fact, in order to deliver this mini city within a city, to deliver the healthcare that we need. It's not just about GPs. GPs are important, but so too are all these other workers that enable us to deliver first world services to the standards that Australians expect.
So what we do see in a lot of other sectors, of course, is the consumerization. So when I go to the supermarket now, I scan my own goods and I pack my own bags. And when I do my banking, I do it all myself online. And yet in healthcare, we still deliver a service to a patient. It's very much a hierarchical model, even though we're starting to see rises in consumer technologies in healthcare. So everyone's got a smart watch, which does all sorts of weird and wonderful things. What are your thoughts around how we can get the population to play a much greater role in the healthcare, be it through self-service models, be it through health education? Do you think that's a viable way for us to scale out the limited resources we have?
Well, Louise, like my term, studentification, I'm going to throw another one at you, Louise. This is the great appification of Australia.
Uh-huh.
And this is the use of apps, in fact. And this is the idea that there's a whole range of interactions for society that can now be conducted via an app. Let's just say you're having a medical procedure. The whole booking in process can now be done by app, or should be done by app. And in fact, my local GP in suburban Melbourne, that was during the pandemic. I rang them up, nothing serious particularly. And I said, I want to make an appointment. And the receptionist said, oh, Bernard, I don't make appointments anymore. You have to download an app. I thought, oh my God. But in the end, I downloaded this app, chose my GP, chose the time of day, changed my mind about which day I wanted to, and then sent it off. And then I got a confirmation back. And I thought, how good is this? Why were we not doing this 10 years ago? This is so much easier, in fact. And I think the turning point in the great appification of Australia and the Australian consumer was when, in April 2020, the beginning of the pandemic, we were implored by the Australian Prime Minister, no less, to download the COVID Safe app, which turned out to be completely useless, cost millions of dollars, completely useless, but it taught baby boomers how to download an app. And since then, we have not looked back. Everything, click and collect, an Amazon account, or checking in at an airport, or doing banking, of course, all done through apps. Or you can go to a restaurant, no need for a waiter, just QR code, here's what I want, and a single busboy, whatever they call them, delivers the meal, and then that's it. None of the palaver of a waiter interaction. All efficientizing, another word I've made up, the process, if you like. I think we have accelerated into app interactions, which are replacing the call centre, and not before time too. Who likes sitting on a call centre wait line? When you have an app, you can control the interaction and you can get an immediate response. So I think that certainly in a whole range of interactions with the healthcare system, not just seeing your GP, but checking into a hospital, for example, or I would imagine having a connection with your mum or dad in an aged care home, being on a chat app group to say, well, here's your mum's issues for the day or whatever. You just feel connected with a person rather than, ringing up or whatever. There's one thing that I find incredibly frustrating is trying to ring, a bank or a government department.
Even just finding a phone number is challenging enough.
I think they hide phone numbers. I'm sure of it. Yep. It's like, what number do I ring? And even when I get through to that number, how many times do I have to listen to, 5 different options? Then you make a choice and you think, oh, I'm through. No, then there's another 5 different options in the end. I think this is certainly the way in which service provision, whether it's government services or whether it's healthcare or aged care services, I think the great application. Now, the issue was never with millennials or X's about downloading apps. It was always about, the slow uptakers and the baby boomers after a COVID-safe app experience. Useless as it was, that technology, highly valuable in encouraging people to learn about the great apps that can make your life more seamless, more efficient, in fact.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, so future trends. What future trend or shift, aside from what we've already discussed, do you think healthcare leaders aren't paying enough attention to that they should be?
Well, I've always thought, why is there no obsession with learning from the way in which healthcare is delivered in first world nations, other first world nations that are maybe 10 or 20 years ahead of us, and that is Japan, as an example. Are there study tours of, so the CEOs of hospitals and aged care facilities, should they not be going to Japan and saying, here is how the Japanese do this, here is the automation, here is the great appification that is underway in Japan or whatever, and here is the way in which aged people are integrated into the community. There's this wonderful story of a cafe that has been open, that's been running for about 6 years now in a suburb of Tokyo. You can Google it. It's a great story. It is called the Cafe of Misplaced Orders.
Oh.
And it is the waiters in this cafe, dementia patients at a nearby facility. It gives them, something to do. And the fun thing is that dementia patients confuse the orders, but people go along in goodwill to support the organisation. And look, you might have asked for, whatever it is, smashed avo or whatever, and you get a different order, perhaps, or you might get the order you wanted. Anyway, it is done with such good grace, good fun, good humour, engagement. It's bringing the dementia patients actually into the community, part of the community, and not in a, oh, poor you kind of way, but in a fun, it's changed the conversation. The Cafe of Misplaced or Mistaken Orders in Tokyo. I can see Louise is checking it out.
Yeah, I'm just looking it up on my phone. I'm like, this is really cool.
Yeah, it is. But again, this is the idea that changing the conversation is good. I know, look, there's the hard-edged tasks of ensuring funding, of getting skills and accreditation and whatever, but also of just changing the tone, thinking laterally, and learning from countries that are more advanced than us in this issue. And Japan, that's a wonderful country. I've only been there once and certainly wasn't on a study tour, but I always thought this is a big issue, costs a lot of money, it's a bucket load. How do they manage it? They don't have the same immigration program. Look at the aged care workers in Australia, substantially Indian or Filipino or Nepalese. In fact, I don't think that's the case in Japan. How do they do it? What is the system? What can we learn? What can we cherry pick from that community and possibly others to prepare Australians for what lies ahead?
I think that's a really valid point, and it's been actually one of my bugbears because I've actually visited Japan a couple of times, and just recently I was in Singapore for Aging Asia, where we had a lot of the Asian countries. However, Australian governments generally don't like to send people over on fact-finding missions because they're considered to be a jaunt rather than a thing. But the reality is there's so much we can learn, and it is challenging.
I agree. I should start a business, Bernard Salt, Aged Care Tours of Japan. I'm deadly serious about this. Look, the junket element does, it's a bit of a drawback, although I don't think that necessarily applies to some people. But I do think that learning from others to create different stories, different narratives, different interactions with patients and workers, in fact, I think is an initiative that I've yet to really see.
One of the organisations I'm involved with is called the ECH Alliance. So they're actually doing a lot of work now in countries like Africa and Asia, looking at, again, they started off in Europe, but how do you share that learning? So I think sharing learning is a great opportunity that we haven't really taken full advantage of here in Australia yet.
Exactly. And I wonder whether, in fact, we aren't doing things that others could learn from as well. No, I think it does need to be across developed countries. If you were to go to parts of Africa, well, firstly, there's an issue with longevity, life expectancy, but also the model of sort of multi-generational households doesn't quite suit the Australian demographic at the moment. But yes, I'm all for looking broadly and laterally and creatively, not necessarily tweaking it. That was a good concept, but I think we can Australianise it here and develop something that would suit the Australian market.
Well, one of the interesting things that does come out of second and third world countries is the concept of frugal innovation, but so not a $50 million innovation project, but doing things, with whatever resources you have available. And I think that's probably something we can learn as well.
Oh, I like that. Frugal innovation. George, I'm going to nick that term.
You're more than welcome to it.
Yes, frugal innovation.
No, I love it. Bernard, you've been such a wonderful guest. Thank you for sharing your insights and all the knowledge and the numbers that you have in your head with not just George and I, but with the Pulse Potties, our listeners. This is going to be really fascinating. I let a few people in my own orbit let them know I was interviewing you today. And they're like, oh, really? You've got Bernard Salt on the show. So we really, really appreciate your time. Thank you.
My pleasure. And yes, been great fun. Nice to chat with you both. Thanks, Louise, and thanks, George.
Thank you very much, Bernard.
George, it was so good having Bernard on the show. We've had a lot of really positive feedback about part one. So I think part two, people are going to get a lot of value out of it as well. I certainly enjoyed re-listening to it again. Were there key takeaways that you had from our chat with Bernard?
Look, I think he really covered a very broad range of things, which are very relevant to healthcare because, when we talk about public health and demographics, understand who we're delivering healthcare services to is important and how that's going to change. And it's not just the workforce issues, it's the financial issues associated with that and the interplay and also that mixture between the various generations. My favorite is still his kippers, kids in parents' pockets eroding retirement savings. I love some of his acronyms. My kids get very confused when I walk around and calling them kippers.
And yes, you're living the dream with those kids at home. Yeah, no, Bernard and his most recent piece, which he publishes in The Australian, but also if you don't read The Australian or especially if you're international, Bernard's on Instagram and you'll see the links that we've put in the show notes to how you can connect with Bernard Salt. One of them is his Instagram and he's really diligent in putting his stories there as well. And he's a great thinker. So yeah, it was great to have him on the show. Really appreciative he could be here.
He does that on his LinkedIn feed as well, where he puts stories in. So you don't have to worry about getting behind a paywall just for one article. But they really do make interesting reading. Highly recommend them.
Yeah, great thinking. All right, George, do you have any recommendations for the Pulse Potties this week?
I've started listening to a new podcast by Ashish Jha, who's the Dean of the Brown University School of Public Health. I actually met Ashish a few years back. At that stage, he was at Harvard. And when I did a postgrad health course over there, he was there. And he was a really smart, interesting person. He worked with our good friend Blackford Middleton and John Kolemko over there. His new podcast is called A Moment in Health. And it's pretty cool. It's only about a 10 or 15-minute podcast once a week. And what he does three things. He shares an interesting data point and discusses it, an interesting study and discusses it, and then looks at one specific public health related question and usually with the help of a guest discusses that. So it's a nice, short, succinct educational process. I quite enjoyed that.
Oh, cool. Well, send me the link and I'll check it out because I haven't heard that one. But I'll put the link to it in the show notes as well so other people can find it.
Shall do. And yourself, what are your recommendations?
Yes, well, I do have a recommendation, and it's something else from a friend of Pulse. So Dr. Chris Longhurst, who was on the show back in August last year, he is formally calling for professional organisations to create national guidelines on disclosing AI use in patient communication, which is great. Why would that not be default? But anyway, it's not the default, clearly. So Chris and his colleagues from UC San Diego have published it in the New England Journal of Medicine AI, which is a great journal. Like, they are publishing so much content. So the journal is incredible. But yeah, the pieces in there, I'll put a link to it in the show notes because it's a really good overview of their experience that others can learn from. Because UC San Diego, they've been drafting replies to patient messages using AI since April 2023. So that's like over 2 years they've been doing that. Yeah, so there's experience of theirs that's really worthwhile that you can learn from. So I'll put that in as my recommendation, some practical stuff, thanks to Chris, that we can all learn from and hopefully be put into practice. All right, George. Well, as I said, everyone else you'll be listening to us going, well, Louise, we saw you at the Digital Health Festival. And George and I had to record this early because, yes, George is getting on a plane and flying to Melbourne. And we normally record when the Digital Health Festival is on. So that wasn't going to work for us because we want to attend. So it's early this week. I'm looking forward to seeing you, George, and hanging out with you this week.
Looking forward to catching up with 8,000 of our best friends at the Digital Health Festival and discussing all these topics in real life.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, and we also got quite a few people reach out to us to request one of the tickets that we had to give away to the festival. So thanks those who reached out and put a public review up for us as well. We would have accepted negative ones. You didn't have to say nice things, but you did. So thank you. Really appreciate that. All right. Well, thanks for listening. George, could you read us out today, please?
Thank you for listening to Pulse, brought to you by Pulse IT News. Pulse is produced by Ivan Jurek of Octopod Productions. Big thanks to everyone for listening. Make sure you subscribe, follow and rate us wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget, you can visit pulseit.news to sign up for the new newsletter and explore Pulse IT's massive digital archive. Send any feedback or topic suggestions to pulsepod@pulseit.news. We'd love to hear what's on your mind and look forward to seeing you all in Melbourne at the Digital Health Festival.